Somewhere in northern British Columbia, there is a town with perfectly mowed lawns, working street lights, and a swimming pool kept clean for absolutely no one. The lights have been on since 1983. A billionaire pays millions of dollars a year to maintain it. Population, 0. And that is not even the strangest ghost town we are going to talk about today. Canada has more abandoned communities than most countries have towns. We are talking about more than 600 ghost towns in Newfoundland alone. Some lasted centuries before vanishing. Others made it 18 months. Some were drowned deliberately under lakes. Some were erased from maps by the government so they could not slide back into existence. And some are so perfectly preserved that walking through them feels less like exploring ruins and more like everyone just stepped out for a very long coffee break and never came back. Here is what nobody wants to acknowledge about ghost towns. They are not ancient history. New ones are being created right now. In 2025, the last 4 residents of Tilt Cove, Newfoundland announced they would accept resettlement. Canada's smallest incorporated town is about to disappear. The forces that created these abandoned places include single industry dependence, boom and bust cycles, and governments deciding which communities deserve to exist. They have not gone anywhere. So, let us talk about 12 ghost towns you are not supposed to know about. And we are starting inside a national park. Number 12 is Bankhead, Alberta. At its peak, around 1,500 people live there. And here is what makes this one absurd. It is inside BA National Park. In 1903, the Canadian Pacific Railway established a coal mine at the foot of Cascade Mountain. And the town that grew around it was more modern than BA itself. It had a municipal water supply, a sewer system, electricity, and street lights. While BA was still figuring things out, 300 men worked underground excavating 200,000 tons of coal per year. The problem was the coal. It was terrible. It was so brittle that by the time it reached the end of the production line, nearly half of it had crumbled to unusable dust. The miners dug over 185 miles of tunnel trying to extract something usable. Labor strikes in the 1920s finally broke the operation. The Canadian Pacific Railway closed the mine in 1922. Since it was a company town, the company owned literally everything, so residents had nowhere to go and nothing to stay for. By 1926, buildings were being physically moved to BA, Canmore, and Calgary. The railway station is now on the grounds of the BA hostel. Then in 1930, the National Parks Act made any future mining in BA illegal. Bankhead was officially forbidden from ever coming back. There is also a local legend that a Chinese laundryman named Sam Singh cursed the town after being wrongly accused of murder and deported. The mine closed a few weeks later. Coincidence probably, but it is a better story than saying the coal was too crumbly. Today, you can hike a 1-kilometer interpretive trail through the ruins. It is family-friendly. There are educational signs. The mountain looms overhead like it has been watching this whole time. Number 11 takes us somewhere much darker. Gros Isle, Quebec. This is not a ghost town in the traditional sense. It is a ghost island and the ghosts here are very, very real. Let that sink in for a second. 5,424 people were buried here in 1847 alone in mass graves with coffins stacked 3 deep. Gros Isle sits in the St. Lawrence River 48 kilometers downstream from Quebec City. In 1832, the government established it as a quarantine station to screen immigrants for cholera. For 105 years, over 4 million people passed through this island on their way into Canada. But 1847 was the Black Year. The Great Potato Famine was devastating Ireland and nearly 100,000 refugees fled to Canada on what became known as coffin ships. So named because so many passengers died during the crossing from typhus malnutrition and overcrowding that bodies were thrown overboard. The first ship, the Syria, arrived on May 17, 1847 with 430 fever cases. By the end of May, 36 vessels were waiting in a line stretching 2 down the river. At one point, 40 ships carrying 12,500 sick passengers were anchored offshore simultaneously. Dr. George Douglas, the medical superintendent, wrote that he never contemplated the possibility of every vessel arriving with fever as they do now. He had no beds, no resources, no way to help. The quarantine was so overwhelmed that doctors examined patients by having them walk past and stick out their tongues. Many who passed as healthy developed fever weeks later and spread typhus to 20,000 Canadians across the country. Robert White, who kept a famine ship diary, described a continuous line of boats, each carrying its freight of dead, to the burial ground. Some had several corpses so tied up in canvas that the stiff, sharp outline of death was easily traceable. Bodies were dragged from ship holds with hooks stacked on the shore like cordwood, buried in long trenches because individual graves took too long. A Celtic cross now stands on Telegraph Hill overlooking the mass graves. The inscription reads, "Children of the Gale died in their thousands on this island, having fled from the laws of foreign tyrants and an artificial famine." Today, it is a Parks Canada National Historic Site. You can visit by boat. The meadow is corrugated with ridges. The mass graves, simple white crosses, mark the unknown dead. Even on sunny days, there is a weight to the place, the gulls keen, and the rain patters. Over 7,480 people are buried here. And this is not ancient history. The descendants of orphaned children who were adopted by Quebec families still live in the heartland of the province. The island remembers what we have forgotten. Moving right along to something considerably less heavy. Number 10 is Rowley, Alberta. Population 12. And honestly, that might be generous depending on who you ask. Rowley started as a railway town in 1912. At its peak, around 500 people lived here, serving the farms and ranches of the surrounding prairie. Then the railway ended service. The Depression hit and drought drove farmers away. The usual story. By the 1980s, it was essentially abandoned. But here is what makes Rowley different from every other dying prairie town. The remaining residents decided to lean into it hard. They turned their ghost town into a movie set. Superman 3 filmed here. Bye Bye Blues filmed here. Various commercials and smaller productions used the town. The locals maintain the building specifically for film crews. They dress up mannequins and place them around town. They have created a kind of performance art piece out of their own decline. You can wander through the old general store, the bank, the churches, all preserved in the early 20th century aesthetic that production designers love. There is something darkly funny about a community that watched its population collapse by 98% and responded by saying that at least they were photogenic. The challenge is that Rowley is not really a ghost town anymore. It is a theme park operated by its 12 remaining inhabitants, which raises philosophical questions about authenticity that I am not qualified to answer. What you get is easy road access, well-preserved buildings, and a genuine prairie atmosphere. What you are committing to is visiting a place that knows it is a tourist attraction and has made peace with that identity. The downsides are real. There are no services, no accommodations, and if you show up expecting atmospheric solitude, you might find a film crew instead. But if you want to see what a small prairie town looked like in 1920 without the inconvenience of time travel, Rowley delivers. Is it a ghost town? Sort of. Is it a museum? Kind of. Is it a strange little community holding on through sheer force of personality? Absolutely. Number 9 is where things get genuinely unsettling. Uranium City, Saskatchewan. Peak population was around 5,000 in the surrounding area with about 2,500 in the city proper by 1981. The current population is approximately 70 people and you need to fly in because there is no road. Here's the thing about Uranium City. It powered the nuclear arms race. This was the locus of Cold War uranium mining in Canada throughout the 1950s, the linchpin of the country's nuclear aspirations in the 1960s and the 1970s. The government specifically designed this town to be a model mining community, architecture award-winning houses, modern infrastructure planned for 5,000 people, a high school literally named Canada High after the Canadian nuclear reactor. The future was radioactive and Uranium City was cashing in. Then on December 3, 1981, El Dorado Nuclear announced over CBC radio that the Beaver Lodge mine would close in 6 months. No warning, no consultation, just a radio broadcast. Dean Klassen, who still lives in Uranium City, remembers. They announced the shutdown of the mine on the radio. Everybody in town lost jobs instantly. Housing values went to zero overnight. Kids in school were crying that day. Some families had just moved to town. The houses built to last generations became worthless between breakfast and lunch. By June 1982, 90% of the population had left, some by jet, many by the ice road that opened for 6 weeks. Water and sewer utilities were shut off to outlying areas. The remaining residents moved into a shrinking core. Kanda High School, which opened in 1979 with optimism for the future, closed in 1983 after just 4 years and 3 graduating classes. Today, Dean Klassen walks through those abandoned hallways and says, "I still see my friends running up and down the hallways." If you look at all the destruction and things that aren't there, I look at the good things. When he flies into Uranium City now, he says it still feels like coming home. That is both deeply moving and quietly devastating. The buildings are collapsing. The infrastructure is failing. You can't even get insurance on homes here anymore. But for the 70-odd people who remain, it is still theirs. Uranium City is not quite dead. It is something worse. Dying in slow motion while the world watches. If you have made it this far, consider subscribing. It is completely free and we are always improving to bring you even better videos. Number 8 brings us to Sandown, British Columbia. Peak population was 5,000. Current population is a handful of stubborn souls and some extremely confused trolley buses. Let's be real about Sandown. In the 1890s, this was the silver capital of Canada, 29 hotels, 28 saloons, its own stock exchange, electric lights before Vancouver had them, 5,000 people in a remote mountain valley because silver was worth more than common sense. The boom lasted about as long as you'd expect. Silver prices crashed. Miners left. By the early 20th century, Sandown was already declining. Then in 1955, a flood destroyed most of the remaining buildings. Nature delivered the final eviction notice. But here's where it gets weird. In the 1980s, someone started collecting abandoned Vancouver trolley buses and parking them in Sandown. The plan apparently was to restore them. Reader. They were not restored. They're still there. Rows of rusting trolley buses from the 1940s and the 1950s sit in a town full of storefronts from the 1890s. 3 eras of abandonment in one location. The silver boom, the flood damage, and the failed restoration project. It's almost too perfect as a metaphor. What you get at Sandown is the easy road access. Unlike most British Columbia ghost towns, you can drive right up to it. The wooden buildings lean at concerning angles. Mining equipment rusts in the forest. A creek runs through what used to be Main Street. It's atmospheric as hell. The challenge is that nobody is really preserving anything. The buildings are collapsing. The trolley buses are rusting. There is no interpretive center, no admission fee, no organized experience. You are basically exploring an active decay site. Wear sturdy shoes. Watch for unstable structures. And maybe take a moment to appreciate that Sandown had electric lights in 1892 and now has nothing but empty storefronts, dead buses, and the creek that killed it. Progress isn't always linear. Sometimes it goes backward. Number 7 is Val-Jalbert, Quebec. Peak population was 950. This one genuinely surprises people because it might be Canada's best preserved ghost town. And you can sleep there overnight. In 1901, entrepreneur Damacy Jalbert built a pulp mill at the base of the Wionne Falls. That waterfall is 72 meters tall, taller than Niagara Falls. The power it generated let Jalbert create a model company town decades ahead of its time. Workers here had electricity and indoor plumbing when most of rural Quebec was still using outhouses and oil lamps. They earned double the going wage. The surrounding population envied them. 94 buildings went up. Houses, a general store, a convent school, and the massive mill itself. By 1926, Val-Jalbert was thriving. By August 13, 1927, it was over. Demand for non-transformed mechanical pulp collapsed. The mill closed, and because it was a company town, there was nothing else to stay for. One former child resident later recalled that it was the first time we saw our parents cry. Within 2 years, the entire village was deserted. The priests and nuns left on September 15, 1929. The company ordered all homes boarded up. And then something remarkable happened. Quebec preserved it. The government acquired the site in 1949 after the company failed to pay taxes. It opened to tourists in 1960, making it one of Canada's first ghost town preservation projects. Today, you can wander through streets with French names, peer into crumbling houses with trees growing through the roofs, visit the restored general store, and watch the 72m waterfall thunder past silent streets. They have invested over $19 million in revitalization. There is a cable car to a glass viewing platform above the falls, a restaurant in the old mill, and yes, you can book overnight accommodations in restored homes from the 1920s, paying to sleep in a ghost town. There is something almost uncomfortable about that. Tourism built on tragedy, commerce in the ruins of community. But Val Jalbert escaped the fate of most ghost towns. It was not burned, not flooded, and not erased from maps. It was frozen in amber and sold back to us as heritage. Whether that is preservation or exploitation probably depends on how you feel about gift shops in the general store, where children once bought candy before their parents started crying. Numbers 6 and 5 are both in Newfoundland. And honestly, they're part of the same heartbreaking story, so we're covering them together. Great Paradise had a peak population of 197. It was founded in 1758 and abandoned in 1967. Ireland's was home to several dozen families. It was settled in the 1700s and abandoned in 1966. Both were victims of Joey Smallwood's resettlement programs. Here is what you need to understand about Newfoundland. Between 1954 and 1975, the government relocated approximately 30,000 people from over 300 communities. That's roughly 10% of the province's population. The official reasoning was that scattered out poor communities were economically unviable. Services were too expensive to maintain. People needed to be consolidated into growth centers where jobs would magically appear through spin-off industries. Families received $1,000 plus $200 per dependent to abandon homes their families had occupied for generations. But here is the catch. The program required from 80 to 90% of a community to agree before anyone got paid. Imagine the social pressure. Your neighbors needed you to vote yes or they could not afford to leave. Communities that had existed for 2 centuries were torn apart by democratic procedure. Great Paradise had survived since 1758, over 200 years. After resettlement, the famous red church spire stood alone for decades, visible for miles at sea, a monument to everything that was erased. The government literally removed resettled communities from official maps to prevent them from sliding back into existence. At Ireland's Eye, families refused to simply abandon their homes. They floated their entire houses across the bay on oil drums because the resettlement payment could not replace what they were leaving. Houses were worth more than $1,000. Hayward Blake, who was resettled from push-through at age 13, later said that he had heard from a number of people who dropped out of school and who were bullied when they went to their new communities. One woman told him that after her family resettled, other students made her the laughingstock of the school. She quit and went to work at the fish plant. Her entire life trajectory was altered. Bar none. Researchers found that everyone said the same thing. He did not really force us out. But he left us no choice. The growth centers never grew. Many became unemployment traps. Today, these abandoned outports are some of the most beautiful coastal landscapes in North America. Tourists pay to visit what the government paid people to leave. Number 4 is Ocean Falls, British Columbia. Peak population was 3,500 in 1950. The current population is somewhere between 25 and 35, depending on who is counting. It gets approximately 173 in of rain per year. That is 4,390 millimeters for anyone keeping metric score. Ocean Falls is one of the wettest places in North America. The locals call themselves the Rain People. In 1906, a pulp and paper company saw opportunity in all that water. The falls generated cheap hydroelectric power. The water from Link Lake was so pure, it did not need filtering to make white paper, unheard of in the industry. By 1917, the mill was the largest in British Columbia, producing newsprint at 600 feet per minute. For decades, Ocean Falls thrived despite its impossible location. You could only reach it by boat or float plane. The rain never stopped, but the company provided everything. Housing, a hospital, schools, and the second largest hotel in British Columbia. It was a tight-knit community bound by shared isolation and chronic dampness. Then, in 1973, Crown Zielerbach decided to close the mill. The provincial government bought it at minimal cost and tried to keep it running. By 1980, they gave up. The population had already crashed from 3,500 to under 100. Buildings started collapsing under the relentless rain. The former mill, the hotel, the houses, all slowly succumbed to precipitation. There is a grim irony here. The same water that powered the mill, that made the paper pure, is now destroying everything humans built. And yet, Ocean Falls is not quite dead. The dam still generates electricity. About 30 people hang on. The old bank operates for visitors. And here is the twist nobody predicted. There is now a Bitcoin mining operation using excess hydroelectric power. A 21st century use for 20th century infrastructure. You can visit Ocean Falls by BC ferries. It stops on the run between Bella Coola and Bella Bella. The mill building looms empty. The boardwalks crumble. The rain falls and falls and falls. Somewhere in the ruins, computers mine cryptocurrency. While former Premier John Hahn probably shakes his head, he worked at the mill as a university student. Even he could not save it. Number 3 is Silver City, Yukon. Number 2 is Antioch in British Columbia, Canada's largest ghost town. We're covering both because we are building to something bigger. Silver City, population several hundred at its peak, is now 0. This was a Klondike-era settlement that sprang up after gold was discovered in the region in 1903. For about 20 years, people actually believed they could sustain a community here based on mining, but they could not. The ore played out. The location was too remote. By the 1920s, everyone was gone. What makes Silver City eerily compelling is how little has been preserved. Shelves still lined with rusty cans. Abandoned trucks slowly returning to the earth. Pink fireweed pushing through collapsed floors. Nobody cleaned up. Nobody removed anything. They just walked away and let the Yukon reclaim it. It's the Klondike dream frozen in decay. All that hope and ambition rusted to nothing. But Antioch is different. Antioch was massive. At its peak, the population was 3,000. At its height in 1914, it was one of the largest communities in British Columbia. It was a copper mining town with a hospital, golf course, curling rink, tennis courts, and the tallest dam in Canada. Over 25 years, the mines produced 340,000 tons of copper, 230 tons of silver, and 4 tons of gold. The pollution was apocalyptic. Smelter workers were called gas eaters because of the intensity of the fumes. Some could not work more than 2 hours continuously. Residents had to plan laundry day based on wind direction to avoid black soot. When the air was still, the whole town had nosebleeds. And the children, they made a sport of setting the snow on fire. The sulfur contamination was so severe that snow actually burned. Let that sink in. Light bulbs were etched with the word stolen because workers kept taking them. Now collectors treasure those bulbs as artifacts. By 1935, the Great Depression had crushed copper prices. 50 million kilograms of unsold copper, 3 years' worth of production, sat stacked at the harbor. No buyers. The mine closed on July 31, 1935. Everyone lost their homes overnight. Peter Lden, born in Antioch in 1930, later wrote that Antioch was born quietly, but she went out with a bang, or at least the bang heralded the end. Lightning fires in 1942 and 1943 burned every wooden structure. The war effort stripped all the metal for salvage. Only concrete and steel skeletons remain. Today, only 2 permanent residents live there. The rust-red tailing fields support nothing but stunted trees and carnivorous plants. You can only reach it by boat or float plane. It is Canada's largest ghost town, accessible to almost no one. And finally, number 1, Kitsault, British Columbia. Peak population, 1,200. Time occupied before complete abandonment, $18 months. Cost to build, $250 million. That's over $800 million in today's money. This is exactly as absurd as it sounds. In 1979, Phelps Dodge Corporation built an entire instant town from scratch to house molybdenum mine workers. We are talking 100 houses, apartment buildings, a shopping mall, a swimming pool, a curling rink, a hospital, a theater, everything a community could need. Families moved their entire lives here. Betty McCormick, her husband Ben, and their 3 daughters were among the first arrivals in early 1981. The company paid their moving expenses. The town had everything. In April 1982, the shopping mall held its ribbon-cutting ceremony. Weeks later, the mine announced it was suspending operations because molybdenum prices had crashed. By November 1982, the suspension became permanent. Residents received eviction notices. "We love it here," Betty McCormick told the Vancouver Sun in July 1983. "It's a great little community. It's a shame it had to shut down." The deadline to leave was Halloween, October 31, 1983. Most families were gone by then. The school was barged to Kamloops. Modular homes were shipped to Terrace in Alberta. On October 1, 1983, dozens of neighbors gathered at the Maple Leaf pub for one last drink. They signed their names on a document and taped it to the wall. That document is still there. On November 10, 1983, Larry Pajak and Reg Peary became the last 2 people to leave Kitsault. A sign asked the last person to please turn out the lights. They did not. The lights are still on. In 2005, Indian-Canadian businessman Krishnan Sawantharan bought the entire town for $5.7 million, less than 3% of what it cost to build. He renamed it after his deceased mother. Since then, he has spent over $25 million maintaining it. He keeps 10 caretakers on payroll to mow lawns, fix roofs, and change light bulbs for a population of 0. The swimming pool is kept clean. The hospital has barely used medical equipment. The library still has due date cards from 1982. The hospital waiting room has an ashtray. Curling trophies have blank bronze spaces where winners' names were never engraved for bone spiels that were planned but never played. I would say that you will see Kits thriving within the next 10 years. Sawantharan said in 2023 he has owned it for 20 years. The town has been empty for over 40 years. In 2022 he closed it to the public entirely. Kitsault sits there in the northern British Columbia wilderness, pristine and preserved, waiting for residents who will probably never come. A $250 million monument to the belief that prosperity is permanent. A warning that communities can vanish faster than anyone imagines. And a very expensive ghost town where the lights are still on, maintained by a man who believes in a future that may never arrive. If you take anything from these 12 stories, maybe let it be this. Every one of these places was once someone's main street, someone's childhood home, someone's entire world. They had grocery stores and schools, and neighbors who knew each other's names. The speed with which they were abandoned and forgotten should unsettle anyone who thinks their own community is permanent. The forces that created these ghost towns have not disappeared. They are just waiting for the next commodity crash, the next corporate decision, the next government policy that decides some communities matter and others do not. And when it happens, someone might be the last person to turn out the lights. But maybe, like a Kitsault, they will leave them on just in case.